It's time for Supply Chain Now. Broadcasting live from the supply chain capital of the country, Atlanta, Georgia. Heard around the world, Supply Chain Now spotlights the best in all things supply chain. The people, the technologies, the best practices, and the critical issues of the day. And now, here are your hosts.
Hey, good afternoon. Scott Luton and Greg White with you here on Supply Chain Now. Welcome to today's show. Greg, how you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm pretty excited about this. We're going to talk about some transformational analytics for supply chain.
We are. And, you know, this is going to be a unique show. If you look at our 415 or so episodes, this is really the first time we're focusing on the area. We've got an industry leader that is also a huge thought leader in the world of customer experience. And this is going to be our first really dedicated show to this topic. So I'm excited. I'm ready to learn something. Are you?
Well, you know, I'm sure anybody who listens to us knows that I don't care much about customer experience, right?
That is not
Only
true.
say something in about every single show. So
that's right.
Yeah, I'm excited.
So more to come on our guest speaker in just a second. But hey, quick programming note. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to find us and subscribe wherever you get your podcast from so you don't miss a single thing. All right. So Greg, with no further ado, let's welcome in our featured guest here today, Stephanie Thum, founding principal at Practical CX. Stephanie, how you doing?
Hey, Stephanie.
Hey. Hi, guys. How are you?
Good.
We're doing really well. Really enjoyed our collaboration, especially kind of around Sapphire Now, the big SAP event. We have been, your ears may have been burning because we've been keeping you on our radar. We love your, in particular on Twitter, of course, plenty of other platforms, but I love the content and just your general approach on Twitter. It's very unique.
Oh, well, thank you. I have a good time. You know, I've been on for like 11 years and, you know, it's so fun.
It really is. And I've learned a ton. I mean, as I shared just speaking for myself, Greg's an expert at everything, but speaking for myself, I'm new to this formal school of thought around customer experience. I've got a background in Six Sigma, of course, service levels, which we'll talk more about. And for that matter, the voice of the customer is the North Star in supply chain, but really geared up about this interview and picking your brain. So Greg, why don't we dive right in?
Let's do that. So we know where you are now. You're in the DC area, but we'd love to hear where you've come from and how you got there. So tell us a little bit about, where you're from, your childhood, any life-shaping moments or anything.
Well, I grew up in rural Missouri, southeast Missouri, in the Boot Heel of Missouri, kind of halfway in between Memphis and St. Louis. I got my undergraduate degree from Arkansas State University while working 3 jobs and a master's degree at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh. And now I'm a part-time PhD student at Indiana Tech.
Wow.
But growing up in Southeast Missouri, learned a lot, as far as a baseline about what we need to think about and consider in customer experience. And I know that may sound a little bit weird, but we can get more into that.
So were you around Hannibal, Missouri?
No, I grew up in Kennett, Poplar Bluff, which is way down there in the Boot Heel, almost into Arkansas.
Yeah. I lived in Springfield.
All right.
And we did a lot of, before you did it for money, bass, before they were Bass Pro tournaments, they were just bass tournaments.
Yes.
First bass shops founded in Springfield, right?
Lots of great fishing in the area.
Yeah, amazing. That's a great part of the world. So that's really impressive. So tell us.
Isn't that the home of noodling, where folks, get into the lakes and they catch catfish with their hands?
Oh, I don't know about that.
I don't know where the home is, but I know it's been done there. I might know somebody personally who's done that. But it is, and it's always done in the darkest, dankest, nastiest water because that's where catfish are.
Wow, not for me.
Yeah. So sorry, I was noodling there a little bit. So let's talk about any life-shaping moments, which we now know was not noodling, thankfully for you, because that's a great opportunity to drink a lot of lake water. But tell us a little bit about your childhood and, tell us someone or somebody that had a big impact on you.
Oh my gosh. Well, my step grandparents owned a farm, and some of my best life lessons were learned on that farm about hard work and community and mindfulness and resourcefulness. And I think about it's a kind of a funny story. My step grandparents had chickens on their farm, right? And my sisters and I sort of had this contest where every day we would take turns and we would go out to the hog house to collect eggs. And it was sort of a contest, whoever could bring in the most eggs. We were sort of the winner. It wasn't any big contest. It was for cool points mainly.
Yeah.
And one day I went out to collect the eggs. It was my turn. And I grabbed a tin pail, as I always do, and went out and gathered the eggs from the hog house. And I got 7 eggs, and it was like, woohoo, this is the big jackpot. And I was, maybe 10 or 11 years old. And I was so proud. And I was walking back up to the farmhouse, swinging that pail, and I dropped it. Yes, you knew where this was going, didn't you, Greg? I dropped it, and those eggs broke. And that was my first lesson for me in mindfulness, learned on that farm. And, when I think about customer experience and where my career has gone, that mindfulness and those lessons on that farm, not just the mindfulness, but the resourcefulness and the sense of community have kind of shaped where I kind of went in life.
Yeah, there's so many tough lessons learned on a farm or a ranch. and you're always generously forgiven when something like that happens.
Oh yeah, my grandmother kind of laughed and was just like, oh well.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's such a great word. Mindful, Greg, that's a word we don't hear enough. This concept of mindfulness, and and that that the story you just shared paints such a perfect visual for that. So really appreciate you sharing. That's I'm gonna talk to my 3 kids this afternoon about mindfulness based on this conversation.
Yeah, right. Somehow I was picturing the front porch from the house in Secondhand Lions and heading across the yard up to that. So, well, that's really interesting. So, from Missouri, did you spend your whole youth growing up in that area of the state or country?
No, I've moved around in my career. I'm a 22-year military spouse, so I've been accompanying my spouse as we've traveled around for the last 22 years as an Army family. So we've lived in several places.
So I've always been fascinated by that. Scott's from the Air Force. I'm from an Air Force town. So I had a lot of friends for 2 years, and I was a Kmart brat, which is a lot like being a military brat, except you never did anything good for your country. So I can empathize with that moving around thing. It creates a certain dynamic in you. You can evaluate people really rapidly and that sort of thing. How did that rub off on you?
Well, I was very fortunate, to have the internet. And it was different. I remember when our life together started, and my grandmother, who's passed now, told me some things about waiting for my grandfather in World War II. And it's just, there's so much less to complain about now, compared to where we have been. But I had the internet. And so because of the internet, there were opportunities to find other military spouses to lean on and to become friends with. And I'm still friends with a lot of them now after 20 or so years.
So did you work while your husband's he's about to retire, right? Full bird colonel?
Yes.
Did you work while he was on active duty?
Yes. Actually, one of the jobs that I had was really instrumental in sort of catapulting me forward in the field and practice of customer experience. I, after graduate school, went to work for the Big Four accounting firm of Ernst & Young. We were living in Pittsburgh at the time. And that was one of the places that we lived. We also lived in St. Louis and Columbus, Ohio. But my 9 or so years at Ernst & Young was really kind of where I started with having Eureka moments, I guess, so to speak, around customer experience.
So were you on those projects? I assume you were doing projects, but on those projects, were you helping design or design processes for retailers, or was there a segment of the marketplace that you worked with particularly?
Yeah. So let me tell you a story. I went to Ernst & Young to work on business development, and I worked on, as I started, proposals. And proposals were the big place where I started. You know, I came from a communication background. My undergraduate degree is in broadcasting. My master's degree is in corporate communication.
Wow.
So I started working on proposals, but I have a background in journalism. And while I was at Ernst & Young, they started this program, and they hired some up and coming people in the firm to go out and form this, well, they formed this new group. And this group was supposed to go out and talk one-on-one with the biggest clients, the at-risk clients, the high revenue clients, to find out what's working well, what could be better, what were our risks, what were the business development opportunities. And it was really your early voice of the customer program.
Yeah.
So I joined this group, and that's kind of where I got my start. That's where I got bitten by the CX bug, because I would sit down with these clients, these fascinating CEOs, COOs, CFOs, and they would talk about the connection between their buying choices as to why they decided to work with Ernst & Young versus a competitor. And it had nothing to do with the proposals I was working on. And it had everything to do, or a beautiful advertisement, it had nothing to do with that at all. It had to do with, you know, could they get their tax attorney on the phone?
Yeah.
Could they get a place to park? Were the bills right? And so, bam, all of a sudden we're talking about experiences that lead to buying choices, that lead to our livelihoods. And so that's really where I was bitten. And that was one of the roles that I had early on in my career and living this life.
So you were sort of an internal consultant to one of the biggest consulting agencies in the world, right?
Yeah, well, you know, I had that journalism background. You know,
Yeah.
I love stories. I've always loved stories. And when I started sitting down with these clients, I started figuring out where that story intersects with business development, and bam. You know, we're talking about how do we need to adjust our processes? How do we need to be measuring and monitoring and triaging red flags internally with our clients to make sure that they don't go to one of our competitors? And so that was early 2000s. So that was kind of before we were really even calling this thing customer experience.
Right.
Customer experience.
Right. It may not have even had much of a name at that point, right?
No. The work that I was doing was, if we look back at it now, it would be voice of the customer and governance. That was really, you know, how we would classify it now.
So I'm curious, what you've described is what may have been your biggest, but I'm curious about or, you know, expanding on that, or any other kind of Eureka moments that you had in your career. I mean, was there a point where something really shifted your point of view?
Well, that story that I just told you was a huge shift, because the story that we had been told all through, you know, late 80s when I was high school, going into college in the 90s, coming up, you know, it was sales, marketing, and nothing about experience. But I just knew, you know, I felt it all along the way that something wasn't quite right. You know, you don't just sell somebody something unless they need it, and they don't keep coming back unless there's a reason why. And so we started to sort of evolve through customer experience. It sort of was the dim started getting brighter to understand what that was. And that's what we were working on. That's what we were developing at the time. And now we have a term for it.
It's really interesting how often it takes to make a critical breakthrough, right? The breakthrough moment is what I think people often remember. But how long it takes to get to that level of awareness is interesting. And I think it's a good lesson for listeners. If you feel like something is missing, it probably is. And you may not be able to put your finger on it, but if you keep looking for it, if you keep seeking that thing that you can't put your finger on, you will have that aha moment.
I agree with you. Trust your gut. That's one of the things that I wish that I'd learned earlier in my career, to trust my gut.
Yeah. Well, I think in our era, our early era, you were taught to believe that the old guard had the answers, and you were to learn the answers from them. And I think that the fortunate happenstance for the generations that are coming into and taking over the workplace today is they were not taught that, right? They were taught by us, children of hippie parents, most of us, right? Question authority, right? Or ask, as my mother, the big mistake my mother made once was to say, hey, ask forgiveness, not permission. She regretted that the rest of our living life. But
So-
yeah, I think that's an important awakening for folks, and I think that's been an important shift in our society, frankly. Right?
Agreed. All right, so let's bring things forward. I love that how you said you're bitten by the CX bug in that pivotal role at E&Y, that internal consult. That's such a great story for how you really found maybe your calling and really had the basis of what now you're helping so many others with. It's this customer experience, regardless of when that became the name for it. My hunch is everyone kind of knew what it was, but it wasn't such a formal, deliberate direction to dive in and study and build best practices around. So that's is that a lot of what you do now as founding principal at Practical CX?
Right. So, my sweet spot happens to be content and customer experience and governance and voice of the customer, collecting those stories, synthesizing them, and then putting frameworks in place to take action on them. But also, content does have a significant role in how customers experience your product, your service. I mean, anybody who's ever bought anything from IKEA and tried to make sense out of the directions knows what I'm talking about with respect to content having a role in the experience that you have with something. So at Practical CX, I work with big companies, small companies, startups, and government organizations to help them kind of put it all together in ways that make sense for them. There's so much advice out there now. It's kind of a crowded space from a consultant perspective, and there's a lot of confusion. And so what I want to do is help my clients make sense of what's going to matter, all of the tools that are in the toolbox. You don't have to use them all, but what's going to make the most sense for your business in the context of your customer base.
So let me back up just a smidge. When did you found the firm, right?
Yes.
So what was the moment, the epiphany you had where you said, you know what, not only am I an expert I was going to use the word preacher, but I'm trying to, a guru in customer experience. What was that moment to say, you know what, this is my calling. I'm going to found a company and we're going to go out there and help others what I've learned?
I have to give credit to my network, to my colleagues and my friends who were knocking on my door over the years saying, I got this thing. Can you help me? I got this problem. I know you got a full-time gig, but could you just give me 5 hours a week? Or could you help me out with this? And that the continuing message was, I don't know what to do. I'm hearing this over here and that over here. Help me make sense of this. And actually, one day my husband and I were out on a long walk and I said, I'm going to call it Practical. I'm going to call it Practical CX because that's what my clients and the people who are knocking on my door were looking for. They wanted practical solutions amidst all of the advice that's out there as to what made sense for their business. And just having, 15, 20 years of experience now and understanding all the tools that are in the toolbox and having just a natural inclination at wanting to understand more about tech and AI and all of the things that are out there that create experiences now. I kind of know what's in the immediate toolbox and what's going to be available to us soon. So being able to put all of that together is something that my clients have continued to value.
Love it. And how long ago did you found it?
Almost a year ago.
Okay. And it's a culmination of doing this for so long. And I love how you put it. I know you got a full-time gig, but give me just 5 hours a week.
Yeah.
And those just things just build up so it makes so much sense. And before we move any further, Greg, I know that story speaks volumes to you. Weigh in. What did you hear there?
Well, I mean, what I think is people should recognize when there is an opportunity, right? And that I can tell you this, if you have any question whether a business or going out on your own is the right thing to do, then listen to those that are asking you, right? There's no better way. And I mean, I advise tech companies all the time. You need friends and family. You need not just for investment, but also as customers, you need someone who hires you because they trust you, right? As much as they appreciate your skill. And that becomes a really, really important part of any business, because the truth is your business practical for now, it is you. And a technology company is too. It is the founder until it reaches a certain threshold. So it has to be about you and your network and those people that trust you. And when people express that, it's a great opportunity to make the leap.
It's such an honor to be trusted. And I see that more clearly now than before, and most definitely agree with everything you said.
Well, and this guy, right? I mean, this is why we have this business too, is, so many people, they know and they trust Scott Luton. And, that's not just the people who grace us with their presence like you, but it's the people who sponsor some of our shows. It's the people who listen, frankly, because they know they're going to get something great, just like your friends and colleagues who came to you to deliver that. So can I shift gears a little bit?
Sure.
And I have a question about your philosophy on CX, because I think we talked a little bit briefly about this pre-show, but I have long thought, and I know you're not a supply chain expert, but you have had some conversations about it, and I think you did stay at a Holiday Inn last night. So I know you didn't. But and there are probably people in our audience who don't even know what that means.
It was a great marketing campaign.
It worked for a while, didn't it?
That's right.
I have long thought that we in supply chain, and I'd love to get your opinion on this, we in supply chain are just one step short in terms of our goals, or in terms of being the intent of our goals. And CX has come to the fore in the last 5 years or so as something that retailers are really knowledgeable about, and I think consumer brands and that sort of thing. But I think we in the supply chain practice need to recognize that customer experience is our goal. That is the end goal, right? A great customer experience is our end goal. And we've used other terms like perfect order, or complete fulfillment, or even service level, 99% service level, to equate to that. And to me, I think service level, which we have typically used as a metric, is just a subset of CX. And CX, that experience that keeps customers trusting you and coming back, that's really the end goal. So I'm just curious of your thoughts about how CX plays into some of these other goals and metrics in a company.
Well, you're swirling around the truth. You're swirling around, and you guys are about to land on it. It sounds like the supply chain world is about to land on this. It's really important. When we think about CX being more important than ever before, we have to keep a clear view of what we're talking about when we talk about customer experience, because there are customer experiences. We've all had them. We all know them. And there is customer experience as a business discipline. And that business discipline includes competencies and skills and tools to understand from your organization and how you serve customers from the outside in rather than the inside out. Voice of the customer, governance practices, human-centered design, employee experience related metrics and measurements, and the things that we look at from a business perspective to improve our business that actually also encapsulate customers and employees. You don't just, it's not a fleeting moment of empathy. It's not a training program. You can't just put on a training program and say, bam, we've done customer experience, we're done. It doesn't work like that. Great experiences for customers and for employees are deliberately designed. You use the tools in your toolbox from a CX practitioner's perspective or a consultant's perspective to design those. And it's not, one of those easy breezy things. So when we try to figure out where we're going to land from a CX perspective in supply chain, it sounds like, the operational metric you're talking about is indeed part of that story, understanding that customer story from the outside in. You also need some other things. You need to understand the customer's viewpoint on that story. Right. If you're going to tell the story with data and metrics. And it could be unstructured data, it could be structured data, but figure out what makes sense for your business and pull it all together. But it usually isn't just one thing. It's usually a combination of metrics and measurements. But that is what we do in CX as a business discipline. It's not a one-time thing. It's not a one, for a month thing. It is a forever thing.
It's culture. It's got to be part of the culture is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, you need, interweave those practices and principles into the fabric of your culture.
All right. So maybe a stupid question, but I'm going to ask you anyway.
Let's go for it.
I love it.
That's all I could ask is stupid questions. So it seems like you would agree that customer experience is more important than ever before. First, for starters, do you agree with that right now?
Absolutely. Competition is crazy.
And so the follow-up question there is why? Why is that? You mentioned the competition word. What else is there that you think is driving customer experience and our fascination with it?
Oh my gosh. Everything about context. The context of the world that we're living in. And you get a different answer from different people depending on where you are about what experience actually means to them. A CEO's opinion is going to be different than a line employee or someone else. It's going to be different. But everyone can agree we're living in weird times. I don't know what other word to call it right now because people are tired of hearing new normal and next normal and COVID era, but the fact remains, and you guys were talking about this. I listened to your show yesterday with Ramatu, when you were talking about how there are new business problems now that need to be solved. And CX, if you think about the tools that we have available to us in CX, think about putting those in your tool shed, or in your toolbox, and use those as tools to help solve those business problems.
I love that because it makes so much sense, especially from that supply chain perspective, right? Let's talk about this is one of the questions I've just been dying to ask as part of this interview. Point to some organizations that really, in your belief and in your expertise, really get customer experience right.
I love this question. And I think folks actually expect me to name a retailer or somebody who's really getting this right. But you know what? Good experiences are subjective. They really are subjective. So I'll just tell you mine. The last time I renewed my car tags through the Virginia DMV, it took me 5 minutes and that was it. So, for a government organization that gets a lot of flack for not doing a good job, cheers to the DMV, because I was able to get it done, and it was hassle-free. Now, there are others who will point to Nordstrom or Zappos or Amazon, and those are great. If those are the organizations that you use and you like the experience and you use it, it's a subjective thing.
Yeah, that's a great point. Greg, what would you add or what would you respond to it?
Yeah, so you named a lot of the big names that are really good. Actually, you made me think of it. First of all, that has to be the first time that a government agency was ever mentioned on the planet as a great customer experience. But frankly, when you mentioned it, I thought of my last couple experiences at the DMV, a particular DMV facility near my house. And I don't know why. Oh, I do know why. I got a couple new classes of driver's license over the last couple of years. So I was there like 3 times in a year and a half or 2. And they felt like family by the time I was there for the 3rd time. I mean, the physical experience was not unpleasant, and they were very accommodating. So it can happen anywhere, but I would not have thought.
Well, what you're talking about is organizations that, regardless, whether it's government or private industry, organizations that make things clear, consistent, they treat you well. Even if you're going to be there having to wait for an hour, at least they've got water and a place for you to sit down, and they're managing your expectations along the way. And you were talking about how things have changed now. Well, there are changing expectations around clean, contactless, inclusive experiences, privacy-centric experiences that have to be considered now. So, but regardless of whether we're talking about the DMV or we're talking about pennies, it's kind of the same things about ease.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, the consumer is in more control of their experience than they have ever been, and there's more ability for them to express. I think the focus here started some years ago when people started being able to post reviews. And then there became this great hue and cry to respond at first it started out as we're going to respond as to why we're so terrible at this. And then it became, as you're talking about, Stephanie, and clearly you must have ushered this in. No, we're not. We're going to respond, and we're going to get better, and we're going to learn from this vast amount of data, right?
Love that.
Right. It's a culture thing.
So Stephanie, kind of piggybacking on Greg's thought there, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like to me transparency is a wonderful dynamic that helps fuel customer experience. And in the society we live in now, pandemic or non-pandemic, there's more transparency than ever before, thanks to the digital revolution. But what else do you think, especially when we talk about these? I love these government agencies that are great beacons of customer experience. I love hearing that, because that's been my experience here in the last few years at our DMV as well. So, hey, this is going to be a love on the DMV episode. I love that.
All right.
Those are hardworking people, so I love putting that recognition
I'm so
there.
glad to hear it. But aren't we all three surprised to hear two other people say
Agree with us.
they had a
Give
great
them credit.
experience? Yeah,
Give them
that's
credit.
fascinating.
Is there that much pressure, regardless if it's the public sector, the private sector, or government? Is there more pressure to get customer experience right today?
I think the pressure is on. The pressure is on all around, and I work with a lot of government organizations and advise government organizations. And from a federal perspective right now, there's a new inflection point because the president's management agenda includes a goal on customer experience. There are now White House guidelines for federal government agencies, the big ones, they call them the high impact agencies, on implementing the practices and principles of CX as a business discipline into the fabric of those cultures. So whether it's coming to you based on what your customers are demanding from a profit perspective, or what legislators and bureaucrats are trying to make sure that they implement into the government setting, the pressure's on all around. There's more emphasis on it than ever before. And it also, is trickling into other areas now. This new inflection point that we're at, it's about more than a website experience now. It's about more than an app experience. We're seeing the principles and practices of CX as a business discipline trickling into risk management areas of organizations and into, to your guys' world, into the procurement ecosystem.
So perfect segue. You're reading my mind here. So as we're speaking to, if you were speaking to our core audience, which is, global end-to-end supply chain professionals, right, at all levels, we get a lot of feedback from listeners that are new to the profession, for that matter, that are still students at the collegiate level working their way through. And then a big chunk, a big plurality of our audience is senior level leaders and all points in between. If you're speaking to that core demographic, why? And I feel like this is another stupid question because we've already made the case, but what else would you add that while supply chain professionals need to pay attention to customer experience?
This is where it is in my mind. And I'm not a supply chain expert, but I have tried to buy before, and I have been a government agency executive that has worked with procurement folks before. And one thing I know for sure is that we need great suppliers and great vendors to create great experiences for customers. We can't do it without there being great vendors in the ecosystem, right? And so from an experience perspective, maybe you want to back up just a little bit. You might not want to call it customer experience. Maybe you want to call it experience management and take a look at the whole ecosystem. Is it easy for vendors to find you and work with you? How are your procurement rules and processes? Are you sending great vendors running the other way because it's too hard to figure out? It's too convoluted to figure out your rules? And you got to think about that in terms of your customers. Okay, so what's the ripple impact on your customers from a cost perspective? How about your employees? Are your employees having a difficult time managing disparate systems and inconsistent experiences for themselves internally? And what's that ripple impact on your business? So think about it from an experience perspective, maybe not just customer experience, but employee experience and experience management in general. Because these practices and principles that we ascribe to in customer experience, voice of the customer, governance, human-centered design, these are tools that work in the procurement ecosystem the same way they work when you're trying to solve other business problems like your website design or your app or your product. You can still apply those principles to making things smoother for the vendors and suppliers that you want in your ecosystem.
They beautiful. There's so much I'd love to dive into. Take the next 5 hours, but really, what my favorite part of what you just shared is, as you are evaluating, not just suppliers, but in reverse, how we onboard suppliers, how we build those relationships. How our organization, at any point in time, the supply chain, how are we making it easy to do business with?
Right.
Because in any industry, there for years there's been a knack to make things difficult because this is our policy, and sometimes, oftentimes, those policies don't even make any sense. So I love what you described there. And you say you're not a supply chain expert, but Greg, I think she's much more of a supply chain expert than she's given herself.
Closer to expert than novice.
Can I get a badge or something?
Yeah.
That's right.
Actually, we're working on that.
All right.
The Supply Chain Now Expert Award.
That's
All
right. But Greg, what else did you hear there that you really find intriguing before we kind of broaden the conversation?
How your team's experience impacts your customer's experience. I immediately flashed to every time I've heard somebody say, this darn computer would lock up now, or choose to download X, or this system Y, right? That sort of thing. Those are the kind of things you need to think about in terms of customer experience. And you also mentioned risk management. So, if you're a retailer or a restaurant, if you're a restaurant, for instance, a big company here in Atlanta with the best chicken sandwich in the world, recently in the last 5 years, diversified their vendor environment, supplier environment, so that they were never out of certain products because they were having not difficulty that was even yet impacting the consumer significantly, but they wanted to have a provision. So risk management is part of your customer experience journey as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I can tell you a little story about that if you want to hear it.
Please.
Absolutely.
So I was working in professional services, and I was going to see clients to find out what was going well and what wasn't going well. And I went out to see a client, and long story short, I found out this professional services setting, this client was getting the wrong bills. So they weren't getting their bills. They were getting the bills for yet another company in another industry in another town. So think about that in terms of the operational risk for the firm that may have just possibly run the risk of a confidentiality breach.
Yeah.
So when you start asking your customers questions and your employees questions in the right way and start listening to them, you can get ahead of risks that you may have never even thought about. And even the Pentagon is doing hackathons now because they want to find their risks and their vulnerabilities. So applying these thought processes to your risk frameworks is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
In government, the inspectors general for the Veterans Administration are now using employee and customer feedback and veteran feedback to get ahead of operational risk. So it is sort of a new thing, but if you do it, you're not going to be the first one. So don't be scared.
I love it. You need to write a book full of these stories you've got. I bet you could probably fill a whole series. All right, so
That's a great idea, Scott. I mean, think about, and imagine the stories you could get if you haven't experienced it yourself. That would be a great series. What's the worst thing that's ever happened to you, or most memorable good thing, or whatever, right?
Well, going back to the earlier point, Stephanie, it is so subjective, and one person's home run experience is the next person's a double off the wall experience,
Right.
I've never really thought about, as I was prepping for this conversation and really thinking about the formal business discipline, as you called it, of customer experience. I was thinking standardized metrics and this, that, and the other, but that's probably one of the things that makes it so difficult is it's so subjective. You want to comment on that, Stephanie?
Yeah, because it definitely is subjective. So that's when you have to step back from a business perspective and figure out what's going to be best for the business. And my recommendation is think about this in terms of your strategic planning initiatives. Work these things into your plans at that level and figure out, okay, suppose we create a goal to improve the ease of doing business for customers. what does that look like? Establish your standardized metrics and measurements, which, you know, they don't necessarily have to stay standard. If you need to change them, change them. Don't be afraid, you know, just explain it depending on whatever environment you're in, and triage that, you know, set up your governance framework where you're measuring, monitoring, and triaging those metrics from a customer's perspective, your customer experience metrics, your operational metrics, your service level metrics that you're talking about, triaging those on a regular basis with a cross-disciplinary team to move the business forward. So it needs to be at that very basic level of how you run your business.
Love it. And one of the common themes here through this conversation is don't be afraid.
Don't be afraid.
Do it different. Do something different. Don't, what's that? The worst or the most dangerous phrase ever is because we've always done it that way.
Yeah.
I mean,
hey, you know, I worked with a small manufacturing company CEO, and we just wanted to start somewhere. And where was the most appropriate for him was to get his human resources person, himself, and his plant manager together once every 10 days or so. And they had about 4 metrics that they looked at, like hiring, order volumes, you know, a couple of different things that they looked at, and they just started. Just start somewhere. It doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be complex. Eventually, you're going to want to work your way into like writing down some guidelines and getting something on paper, but just start.
Love it. No wonder Practical CX is thriving. All right, so let's shift gears. Let's go broader. And there's no shortage of things getting everybody's attention. A lot of folks, as we all know, really challenging times on a variety of levels. Despite all of that, what is a trend or an issue or two that you're tracking more than others, kind of in the greater general business sense right now?
Oh, well, kind of in the vein of some stuff we've been talking about, one big thing on my radar is the work of the U.S. General Services Administration. And for those who don't know, GSA is a government agency that serves other government agencies. And they have what they're calling a federal marketplace. They have right now, they're working on it. They've got a team associated with this, a federal marketplace strategy. And what they're trying to do is take the concepts and principles of CX as a business discipline and apply it to that maze of the buyer-seller ecosystem. And I absolutely love this, because if government can do it, why not other companies? You know? And also I love it because, you know, we're so often in search of the low-hanging fruit and the quick wins. This is not going to be a quick win. So this signals that GSA and that team has the fortitude to really dig in and to figure out where they can make change and adjustments and simplify the process, remove the barriers to entry for qualified sellers. And to me, that is something definitely worth tracking, along with the new frictionless acquisition president's management agenda goal, which is sort of in that spirit, where the government needs great suppliers and great vendors to serve customers, but it's a maze. Even GSA refers to that ecosystem as a maze, and they want to smooth that out with whatever they can do. They need to focus on what they can do, because it is a very complex, convoluted system with a lot of rules and regulations that are not going to change overnight, but they're focusing on what they can do, and they're in it for the long haul. And that's why I'm tracking them, and that's why I like it.
Love it. You know, Greg, I'm all for, there's so much friction in the general climate right now. If there's any way we can make, you know, pick and choose our places where we can really make it easier and streamline it, I'm all for that. Greg, what do you say?
Yeah, likewise. I mean, this is, you know, what Stephanie is describing is why we wind up with $100 screwdrivers and $500 toilet seats, is because there are so many hurdles and regulations, and, you know, we need this thickness of fiberglass or whatever toilet seats are made out of. And, you know, and they make such specific requests that it's very, very costly when commercial grade product will do.
Yeah.
Right.
Needless specs.
So yeah, certainly we need to do that in government. I think likewise, in the private sector, you can do similar things. Make the onboarding process, as Stephanie was talking about, make it smoother. Know your specifications, but know the specifications also of the industry. Right? Why redesign a product that already exists? You can use a screwdriver and say that is sufficient quality. Anything of equivalent or greater quality is acceptable.
Yeah. I think the operative word you just said there is that 3-letter word, why. You know, one of the, in continuous improvement, Yes, it's one of my favorites too. One of my favorite simple tools is the 5 why. You apply that to problems, and you're really trying to get the root cause. Knowing why you do anything is what I'm hearing both y'all speak to.
You just
really
use
good
root
point.
cause analysis. That's a tool in CX. So you're saying you're not a CX expert, but root cause analysis is one of the techniques that we have in CX.
Love that.
Well, you get a certificate.
Or a
Yes.
You get a
badge.
certificate, and you get a certificate. You all get certificates.
All right. Well, this has been as learning or as enlightening of a conversation as we knew it would be.
Yeah.
Really glad that we could find some time in your busy schedule and our busy schedules to come together and have this customer experience conversation. So, Greg,
How do people get a hold of you, Stephanie? Because they're going to want to.
Well, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm also on Twitter, Stephanie Thum. I'm at Stephanie Thum on Twitter, Stephanie Thum on LinkedIn. Practical CX is on Twitter and LinkedIn, and it's on the web at practical-cx.com.
Follow Stephanie on Twitter. It's kick.
It
Follow me.
really
I'll follow
is.
you back. I promise. I follow back.
It's unique. She's got, what I love about it is, Greg, you and I have a little bit of a sense of humor. We've been accused of having, and in Twitter, you've got one of my favorite things. You got folks that take Twitter very seriously, and we've gotten some ads about maintaining that sense of humor. I tell you, 2020, there's no time that has needed to maintain a sense of humor, right? And to keep things, just keep the molehills the size of the molehills. Don't make it, anything that you don't have to into a mountain. And that as you inform and educate your audience, Stephanie, I've really appreciated that sense of humor because it comes out in spades, and it really makes our interaction not just enlightening, but really fun. So appreciate all that you do, Stephanie Thum, at Practical CX, and we'll make sure we include for our listeners ease and convenience for their experience.
There you go.
Make it easy for them to connect and follow you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It was so fun.
Absolutely. We'll do it again.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, Greg, before we wrap up, one last question for you. What has been all this goodness that Stephanie has delivered here today? What's the one thing that you really have found the most effective or powerful or intriguing?
I think I felt like I was aware of this. I hope that I became more aware, and I hope this brings awareness to our viewers and listeners, is that customer experience is more than, as Stephanie said, it's more than how your website works. It's more than how your shopping cart works and things like that. It is the totality of delivering a meaningful and pleasing experience to whoever your customer is. And the thing that I really definitely did learn is whoever your other constituencies are, whether that is suppliers or your employees or partners or whoever it might be. I think that's a really meaningful awakening for me, and I hope for our viewers and listeners as well.
I'm with you.
And do something if you do it wrong.
All right. Don't be afraid to do something.
Right.
I love that. That was one of the common threads of this conversation I've really enjoyed, because now's the time to take action for sure, especially in the business world. But on that note, to our listeners, hopefully you did enjoy this conversation as much as I did, very selfishly. It was what I thought it would be. So, but check us out. If you enjoy these types of conversations, you can check us out at supplychainnow.radio.com. We'd love to hear from you, get your feedback on maybe something that you would like to hear more about. I bet it's going to be customer experience, but nevertheless, we're going to wrap up this episode, Greg, like we always do, challenge our audience just like we challenge ourselves. Hey, do good, give forward, be the change that's needed. And on that note, we'll see you next time here on Supply Chain Now. Thanks, everybody.